What's something your family raised you doing that you later learnt was really weird? Growing up, I had a childhood that most people would think came straight out of an old adventure novel. You know the kind of story: hidden lakes, untamed woods, and a cabin miles away from civilization where you could feel like the last person on Earth. Except for me, it wasn't some fantasy dreamed up by an author. This was my life. My dad's side of the family were big-time backcountry paddlers. The kind of folks who didn't just enjoy the wilderness, they were made. We lived in northern Canada, where the wilderness stretched so far in every direction, it was hard to believe places like it still existed in the world. Some folks dream about road trips or beach vacations. For us, it was all about that first sight of the lake in the morning, still and smooth, without a soul in sight. I can still hear the loons calling out in the fog, their eerie cries bouncing off the water. There's something about a place that remote that makes the world feel ancient, like the trees and the lakes have been around longer than you can even comprehend, and you're just this tiny part of it, passing through. We had this cluster of off-grid cabins that were so remote you could only get there by boat. When I say off-grid, I mean it in the truest sense of the word. No roads, no power lines, no cell signal, just wilderness. Those cabins weren't just a place to escape for a weekend. They were like second homes. We'd spend weeks, sometimes months, up there, whether it was a blistering hot summer or a winter so cold that the air itself seemed to crack and break with each breath. And we didn't exactly make the trip easy on ourselves. It was a family tradition to live off the land, making as little impact as possible. I think my dad took pride in how hard it was to even get to our cabin. You could forget about any modern conveniences. Once we were out there, the rest of the world just disappeared. Looking back, those times felt like a rite of passage, not just for me, but for everyone in the family. My dad was one of those guys who believed that if you couldn't handle yourself in the wilderness, you weren't really living. He didn't say it outright. He wasn't preachy like that, but it was more in the way he lived. It was like he had this deep respect for the land, and if you were lucky enough to be part of the family, you were going to learn how to navigate it, to survive it, the same way he and his brothers had when they were kids. When I was about 7 or 8, that's when my dad decided it was time to start teaching me the ropes. I remember the first time he handed me a knife. It wasn't a big moment for him, just a part of the process. But for me, it felt huge. There I was, holding this tool that could slice open my hand if I wasn't careful, and it was my job to learn how to use it. He started small, of course. How to cut kindling, how to whittle a stick into a spear, how to gut a fish once we caught it. But it was more than just learning how to use tools. It was about learning the land itself. Dad taught me how to identify the plants we could eat and the ones we couldn't. That was the first lesson. The berries, the roots, the mushrooms. It felt like learning magic. One minute, we were surrounded by plants that all looked the same to me, and the next, he'd point out one that was good for a snack and another that would put you in the hospital. I remember looking at him like he was some kind of wizard, the way he could just walk through the woods and know what was safe, what was dangerous, what would keep us alive if we ever got lost. He was methodical about it too. He'd quiz me constantly, asking me what kind of bark a tree had, or how I could tell which direction we were heading without a compass. "Look at the moss," he'd say. "It grows thicker on the north side of the trees, because that's where it's shady. If you're ever lost, look for the moss, and it'll help you find your way." And he wasn't just talking about the moss or the stars or the sound of running water. It was like he was passing down these family secrets. Things his dad had taught him, and his dad's dad had taught before that. I wasn't just learning survival skills. I was being let in on something bigger than that. And honestly, as much as it was tough sometimes, I loved it. There was something about those early lessons that made me feel like I was part of something important. The way my dad would look at me after I got something right, or when I managed to start a fire from scratch for the first time, rubbing sticks together like some kind of cave. I felt proud. Like I was earning my place in this long line of explorers, even if I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. But the best part of the whole year, the thing I looked forward to the most, was summer. School would let out, and before I even had time to take a breath, my dad would be packing up the car with gear, tossing old tarps and fishing rods into the back. He had this way about him, like the second summer hit, his whole demeanor changed. He got lighter, more excited, like he was about to set out on a grand adventure, and in a way, We were. That's when we'd head out for our annual canoe trip with my uncle and cousins. It was always the same. Dad, my siblings, Uncle Dave, and his kids. And we'd be out there for at least a week, sometimes longer. We weren't doing those quick, 2-day trips that people post about on Instagram. No, this was the real deal. We'd paddle for hours, covering about 30 kilometers a day, sometimes more if the portages weren't too rough. It was exhausting, sure, but there was something about it. The rhythm of paddling, the sound of the water lapping against the canoe, the complete and utter quiet of the wilderness around us that made everything else in the world feel like it didn't exist. I think that's what I loved most. When you're out there, just you and the canoes and the trees towering over you, it feels like you're the only person left on Earth. Everything else, the noise, the stress, whatever was going on back home, it all just fades away. All that matters is the next paddle stroke, the next bend in the river, the next campsite that's just around the corner. Even as kids, we were expected to pull our weight. It wasn't one of those setups where the adults did all the heavy lifting, and we got to laze around. No. My dad made sure we knew how to take care of ourselves, even when we were young. I remember those canoe trips like they were yesterday, paddling through endless stretches of wilderness where it was just us, the water, and the sky. There was something raw and unfiltered about it, like we were experiencing the world in a way that most people never got to. We'd fish for our dinners most nights, something my dad took great pride in. He had this way of casting a line, perfectly smooth, no wasted motion, like the rod was just an extension of his arm. He made it look easy, but it wasn't. I'll never forget the first fish I caught, a small trout that barely put up a fight. I remember holding it up, still wriggling on the line, looking over at my dad, who gave me one of those nods like, "All right, now you're getting." There was something primal about knowing that the food we were eating came straight from the lake, pulled out with our own hands. It wasn't just about survival, it was about being part of this place, part of this tradition that went back generations. We were living it. Swimming in those lakes was another story entirely. No matter how warm the day was, the water was always cold enough to steal your breath when you first jumped in. It was like plunging into ice. Your whole body would tense up for a second before you could start kicking, letting the shock wear off as you surfaced with a gasp. But it felt amazing once you got used to it. We'd swim for hours sometimes, chasing each other, racing to the shore, or diving off rocks. It didn't matter that there was no pool or no lifeguard standing by. It felt like we were in our own world, untethered from anything that resembled civilization. When we weren't fishing or paddling, we'd explore. Kids in the city might explore their neighborhoods or their backyards. We explored forests that stretched for miles, full of hidden streams, giant rocks we'd pretend were castles, and trails that could lead you to some of the most beautiful places you'd ever see. Sometimes we'd find an old animal skull or a pile of bones, and we'd come up with wild stories about what might have happened. We'd pretend we were pioneers or explorers, setting out on a grand adventure, even though we never really left sight of the campsite. It didn't matter. We had our imaginations, and out there, that was enough. The nights, though, were something else entirely. There's nothing quite like sitting by the fire, the flames crackling, the wood popping, and the sky above you so full of stars. It feels like you could reach out and touch them. It's the kind of magic you don't find anywhere else. I remember lying on my back, looking up at that endless blanket of stars, feeling so small but so alive. There were no streetlights, no car engines, no city noise. Just us, the fire, and the sounds of the forest. The occasional rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl in the distance. The world felt quiet and vast, like it was waiting for something, but you didn't know what. Those nights are still with. They're the kind of memories that stick, the ones that come back to you when you're sitting in a quiet room, far from where you grew up, and you can almost smell the campfire and hear the water lapping at the shore. But then came the shift. Boarding school. It wasn't something I wanted, but my parents had decided it was for the best. I didn't really get a say. The idea was that by going to school down south, I'd have better opportunities. Maybe they were right, but it felt like being pulled out of one world and shoved into another, one that I didn't understand, and that didn't understand me. I was about 14 when they sent me away. It was the first time I'd ever really been away from home for more than a couple of weeks. The school was down in southern Ontario, near Toronto, and it might as well have been a different planet. The other kids seemed to know each other already, like they'd been doing this forever. They had their cliques, their inside jokes, and I just felt out of place. I thought maybe joining the outdoor education club would be my way in. Figured that was something I could handle, maybe even impress them with what I knew. Boy, was I wrong. Turns out my version of the outdoors was a little too rugged for most people. I remember the first time I started talking about our canoe trips, trying to explain what we did for fun back home. I was excited at first, thinking maybe I'd found some common ground. But the more I talked, the weirder the looks got. These kids had grown up thinking the outdoors meant summer camps with cabins, bunk beds, and scheduled activities. They had no idea what it was like to be off the grid for weeks. To live out of a canoe, cooking over an open fire, and going days without seeing another human being. I'll never forget one girl's reaction. She wrinkled her nose when I mentioned not having a shower for a week and asked if my dad was too cheap to take us somewhere nice. That hit me harder than I'd expected. I didn't know how to respond because it had never occurred to me that someone would think of our trips like that. As something less than, as if staying in a tent or sleeping under the stars was somehow a punishment instead of a gift. It was like a wall went up between me and them after that. I realized I wasn't just some kid from up north. I was different. They didn't understand why anyone would choose to spend their vacation in a place without Wi-Fi or mosquito nets, why anyone would willingly paddle 30 kilometers in a day, swat bugs, and cook fish over a fire instead of going to some beach resort or theme park. I tried to explain it a few times, tried to make them see what it was like, but the more I talked, the more out of place I felt. It was like I was describing some survivalist nightmare instead of a family vacation. I stopped bringing it up after a while. I figured there was no point. No matter how much I tried to explain the magic of those summers, the feeling of sitting by a fire with nothing but the stars above you, they just weren't going to get it. They didn't want to get it. They couldn't wrap their heads around why anyone would choose to spend their time. It didn't take long for me to realize I wasn't just the odd one out at boarding school. I was from a whole different world. A lot of these kids came from serious money, like owning half the oil rights in Alberta kind of money. And they carried themselves like it too. Their families took vacations to Europe, skied in Aspen, and flew in private jets without blinking an eye. They drove imported cars, the kind where the price tag has an extra zero at the end, and wore clothes with brand names I'd never even heard of. I still remember sitting in the common room one afternoon and hearing some guy talk about his parents buying him a Porsche for his 16th birthday. A Porsche. I mean, I didn't even have my driver's license yet, and this kid was picking out the color of his custom leather seats. For them, my life back home might as well have been on another planet. I remember trying to fit in, talking about how my family spent our summers off the grid, figuring maybe I could find some common ground, but it was like I was speaking a different language. Their idea of roughing it meant going to some resort cabin with Wi-Fi, hot tubs, and personal chefs. The fact that we spent weeks in the wilderness, sleeping under the stars, paddling miles every day, and eating fish we'd caught ourselves. It didn't compute. One guy even asked if my parents were survivalists, like maybe we were one of those doomsday families you see on TV, stashing away cans of beans for the end of the world. It didn't help that even the outdoorsy kids at school weren't quite on the same wavelength. Sure, there were a few who liked to hunt, but their version of the outdoors was way different from mine. They'd head out to their family's land, sit in a tree stand, and take down a deer within cell range. When the day was done, they'd head back to their heated cabins, turn on the lights, take a hot shower, and maybe throw a steak on the grill. I'd sit there, listening to them talk, and sometimes I'd try to explain what it was like for me growing up, how we'd paddle all day, sometimes covering 30 kilometers or more if the wind was in our favor, how we'd set up camp wherever we could find a flat spot, cook over an open fire, and sleep with just a thin layer of tent fabric between us and the night, how we'd go days without seeing another person. Just the quiet of the wilderness and the sound of water lapping against the shore. And every single time, I'd get the same reaction. Blank stares, a couple of confused nods, and maybe someone cracking a joke about me being stuck in the Stone Age. I'll never forget this one guy, Derek. Big hunter, always bragging about his family's latest trophy buck, or the new scope his dad had bought him for Christmas. One day, I casually mentioned how we'd spent 3 weeks in the backcountry that summer, paddling from lake to lake, living off what we caught and foraged. Derek laughed like I just told him the funniest joke in the world. You're telling me you didn't have a generator or anything? No cabin? No hot water? He paused, shaking his head. Dude, that's insane. What did you guys even eat? Fish and berries? What? Did you bring a bow and arrow too? I tried to explain it. Tried to get him to see it from my side. How it wasn't about roughing it for us. It was just our way of life. The thrill of catching your dinner. The satisfaction of a fire you'd built with your own hands. The way the stars seemed brighter when you were miles from the nearest power. But Derek and the others couldn't wrap their heads around it. To them, I might as well have been talking about surviving on a deserted island. It was like they saw our trips as some kind of deprivation. Something we had to endure instead of something we chose. And in a way, that made me feel ashamed like maybe there was something wrong with the way I'd grown up. These kids had never gone more than a few hours without their phones, had never had to purify their drinking water from a lake, and had certainly never eaten fish straight out of the water, cleaned and grilled over a fire they'd built themselves. It wasn't that I looked down on them. It was just that we were so different that I didn't know how to bridge the gap. They couldn't imagine my life, and I couldn't understand theirs. I remember one weekend, a group of the guys invited me to their family's hunting lodge up north. They called it Roughing It. So I thought, hey, maybe this will be a chance to connect. Maybe this is where we find some common ground. I packed up my gear, my old knife, a flannel shirt, my beat-up hiking boots, and figured we'd be camping out, maybe hiking in with our packs, setting up tents, the whole deal. Boy, was I wrong. Their hunting lodge was a 3-story cabin with heated floors, a massive stone fireplace, and a kitchen that looked like it had been ripped out of a gourmet cooking show. They had satellite TV, a hot tub, and a fully stocked bar in the basement. The only thing that even resembled hunting was the mounted heads on the walls, and even those felt out of place, like they were more for decoration than anything else. We went out to hunt that weekend, if you could call it. We drove out to a plot of land in one of their ATVs, sat in a heated blind with a view of a clearing, and waited. I could feel my fingers tapping against my knee the whole time, restless. I didn't understand what we were waiting for. Back home, if you wanted to eat, you fished, you moved, you did something. But here, it was just about sitting still, waiting for the animals to come to you. And after a couple of hours, one finally did. A big buck grazing at the edge of the clearing. Derek lifted his rifle, took the shot, and that was that. We loaded the deer into the back of the ATV, and before I knew it, we were back at the lodge, sitting in front of a roaring fire, passing around beers. They asked me what I thought, and I just nodded, trying to be polite. But all I could think was, this isn't hunting. This is just waiting for the grocery store to deliver to your doorstep. I didn't say anything. I wasn't about to start a fight over something they clearly loved, but it hit me hard that weekend, just how different we really were. After that, I started to keep to myself more. I still did well in school, made a few friends here and there, but I didn't try so hard to fit in anymore. I didn't talk about my family's canoe trips, didn't mention the backcountry or the off-grid cabins. It felt like trying to explain those things was a waste of time. These kids would never understand why I loved it, why I missed it. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted them to. For me, those wilderness trips were the best times of my life. They weren't just vacations or getaways. They were a part of who I was. A thread woven into the fabric of my childhood. I still remember the feel of my old camping gear, the stuff that had been passed down from my dad or gifted to me by my uncles. It was all well-worn but sturdy, like it had been built to survive anything. My tent had seen more miles than most people's cars. My sleeping bag had been with me on every trip since I was a kid, weathering rainstorms, freezing nights, and summer heat. My fishing rod? That thing was practically an extension of my arm. And my knife, the one my dad gave me when I was 7, that was something I'd probably never part with, no matter how dull or nicked up it got. To me, that gear wasn't just stuff. It was a connection to my roots. Every piece had a story, a memory attached to it. The time we almost lost our tent to a sudden storm, but managed to stake it down just in time. The countless meals we cooked over a fire started with flint. The blisters I got from portaging with that same old pack slung over my shoulder. It reminded me of where I came from, of my dad, of those long summer days paddling through crystal clear lakes where the water was so still it looked like glass. But my classmates? They didn't get it. They couldn't understand why I treasured my rugged, reliable gear over designer clothes or the latest gadgets. They'd roll their eyes when I showed up to school with my faded old hiking boots instead of some flashy new sneakers. I'd see them walking around with their smartphones and tablets, comparing brands, talking about which one had the best camera or the fastest processor, and I'd just think, who cares? That stuff didn't mean anything to me, not in the way my gear did, not in the way the wilderness did. I used to feel out of place, like I didn't belong. In those early days, I struggled. I'd walk down the hallways at school and see the kids in their designer clothes, and I'd wonder if maybe there was something wrong with me, if maybe I should want those things too. If maybe, just maybe, the way I grew up wasn't normal. But over time, I started to realize something important. What made me different was also what made me strong. Those summers in the wilderness weren't just about adventure. They were about resilience. They were about learning how to make do with what you had, how to find joy in the simple things, and how to survive when things got tough. When you're miles from civilization, you can't just run to the store if you forgot something. You can't pull up an app to solve your problems. You learn to adapt, to fix things on the fly, to make the best of what you've got. And that's where the strength comes from. It's funny, thinking back on it now, how I used to envy the kids who had all the shiny new things. I used to wonder what it would be like to jet off to Europe or stay in a 5-star resort. But honestly, I wouldn't trade those summers in the wilderness for anything. The truth is, I don't need designer labels or exotic vacations to be happy. I found joy in paddling through endless stretches of water, in the crackle of a campfire under the stars, in the quiet hum of nature all around. There's a peace in that, a calm that you can't find anywhere else. I think what I loved most about the wilderness was how it stripped everything down to the essentials. Out there, it didn't matter who had the nicest clothes or the latest gadgets. None of that counted for anything. All that mattered was whether you could read the land, whether you could find shelter, start a fire, catch your dinner, and keep moving forward. There's a purity to it, a kind of honesty that I've never found anywhere else. You can't hide in the wilderness. You can't fake your way through it. It's just you and the elements, and you either rise to the challenge or you don't. Over the years, that's what I've carried with me. That understanding that life isn't about the stuff you have. It's about the experiences, the skills, the connections you make along the way, the resilience to face whatever comes your way, the self-reliance to know you can handle yourself no matter where you are or what's thrown at you. I didn't need to rely on anyone else to get through. I had what I needed, and I knew how to use it. And I started to realize something else too. I didn't need to impress anyone. The truth was, I didn't fit in with the kids at boarding school, but that was okay. I didn't need to fit in. I didn't need their approval or their understanding. My life had been shaped by different experiences, and that was something I could be proud of. I came from a place where the wilderness was our backyard, where we made our own fun, and where we took pride in living off the land. I didn't need Wi-Fi or a hot tub to be happy. I found my joy in the stillness of a remote lake, in the feel of the paddle in my hands, and in the satisfaction of a fire built from scratch. There was a moment when all of this clicked for me, when I finally understood that the things that set me apart from the others weren't weaknesses. They were my strengths. I was different, yes, but that difference was what made me who I was. I didn't need to change. I just needed to embrace it. I don't think I ever told anyone at school this, but when things got rough, when I felt out of place or like I didn't belong, I'd go back to my room, pull out my old gear, and just hold it in my hands. The weight of that knife, the feel of that fishing rod, the smell of my sleeping bag, they were all reminders of where I came from, of who I really was. They grounded. They reminded me that I wasn't lost, even if it felt that way sometimes. And now, looking back on it all, I wouldn't trade a single second of those summers in the wilderness. They made me who I am. They gave me the strength, the resilience, and the appreciation for the simple things in life that most people spend their whole lives searching for. And that's something money can't buy.